If you're enjoying this tale from the Wild West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories of frontier justice and survival. Your support helps us bring these legendary tales to life. The desert wind howled across the barren landscape of New Mexico territory, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day. Jake Morrison pulled his worn hat lower over his weathered face as he guided his horse through the narrow canyon pass. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, constantly scanned the rocky terrain ahead. Morrison had been tracking the Cassidy gang for 3 weeks now, following their trail of bank robberies and bloodshed across 4 territories. The bounty on their heads was substantial enough to keep him fed and supplied for months, but it wasn't just the money driving him forward through this unforgiving wilderness. The sun climbed higher, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold. Morrison's horse, a sturdy bay named Thunder, picked his way carefully over the loose stones. The bounty hunter could feel the animal's muscles tensing beneath him, sensing something amiss in the oppressive silence that had settled over the canyon. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Morrison spotted something that made his blood run cold. Smoke was rising in thin, dark columns from what appeared to be a small homestead nestled in a valley below. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt 45, holstered at his hip, as he urged Thunder down the steep slope toward the burning buildings. The scene that greeted him was one of devastation. The modest farmhouse had been reduced to smoldering ruins, and the barn was nothing more than a skeleton of charred timbers reaching toward the cloudless sky. Bodies lay scattered around the property, and Morrison knew without examining them that this was the work of the Cassidy gang. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the ash-covered ground. The acrid smell of smoke, mixed with something far more sinister, filled his nostrils. As he approached the main house, he heard a soft whimpering sound coming from beneath what remained of the front porch. His hand tightened on his pistol grip as he crept closer. Beneath the collapsed wooden planks, he found them a young woman and 2 small children huddled together in terror. The woman's dress was torn and stained with soot, her dark hair disheveled. Her eyes were wide with fear as she clutched her children, a boy who couldn't have been more than 8, and a girl perhaps half that age. Morrison holstered his weapon and raised his hands to show he meant no harm. The woman flinched as he spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She told him her name was Sarah Coleman, and this had been her home. Her husband Thomas had tried to defend their property when the riders came, but he had been gunned down in cold blood before her eyes. The bounty hunter helped them from their hiding place, his heart heavy with the familiar weight of injustice. Sarah's hands shook as she pointed toward the horizon, where dust clouds still lingered in the distance. The gang had ridden north, toward the mining town of Silver Creek, leaving behind their trademark calling card of death and destruction. Morrison studied the woman and children before him. Sarah was probably no more than 25, with the kind of quiet strength that frontier life demanded. Her son Tommy had his father's determined jaw, while little Mary clung to her mother's skirts with wide, frightened eyes. They had lost everything in a matter of hours. The practical side of Morrison's mind told him to leave them at the nearest town and continue his pursuit while the trail was still warm. But something in Sarah's eyes reminded him of another woman, another family that had been torn apart by violence long ago. His own wife and daughter, taken from him by men not unlike the Cassidy gang. He made his decision quickly, as was his way. Silver Creek was a hard day's ride north, and the Cassidy gang would likely hole up there to spend their ill-gotten gains. But they would also be watching for pursuit, and a lone bounty hunter with a widow and 2 children in tow would be vulnerable on the open trail. Morrison knew of an old line cabin hidden in the mountains east of their position. It had been used by cattle rustlers in years past, but now lay abandoned and forgotten by most. It would provide shelter while he figured out his next move. The woman and children couldn't survive in the wilderness alone, and he couldn't abandon them to face whatever dangers might still be lurking. He gathered what supplies he could salvage from the ruins, while Sarah collected a few precious belongings that had survived the fire. A small wooden cross, a tintype photograph of her late husband, and a quilt that had belonged to her mother were all that remained of her previous life. The journey to the line cabin took most of the afternoon, winding through treacherous mountain paths that Thunder navigated with sure-footed grace. Morrison had fashioned a makeshift saddle arrangement that allowed Sarah to ride behind him while carrying Mary, with young Tommy mounted on a gentle mare they had found wandering near the burned homestead. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they reached the cabin. It was a sturdy structure built from pine logs, designed to withstand the harsh mountain winters. The roof had a few holes that would need patching, but the walls were solid, and there was a stone fireplace that would provide warmth during the cold nights ahead. Morrison set about making the cabin habitable, while Sarah tended to her children. He patched the roof holes with canvas from his saddlebags, cleared debris from the fireplace, and checked the small spring behind the cabin to ensure they would have fresh water. The work felt strange after years of solitary pursuit, but oddly comforting. That evening, as they sat around a small fire, Sarah finally spoke about what had happened. The Cassidy gang had ridden up to their homestead demanding food and fresh horses. When Thomas had refused and ordered them off his property, their leader, a man with a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his jaw, had laughed and drawn his pistol. Morrison knew that scar. It belonged to Red Cassidy himself, the most wanted man in 3 territories. The bounty on his head alone was worth more than most men saw in a lifetime. But Morrison also knew that Cassidy was cunning and ruthless, with a network of informants throughout the territory who would report any sign of pursuit. The next morning brought disturbing news. Tommy had been exploring near the cabin when he spotted riders in the distance, moving slowly along the valley floor below. Morrison studied them through his spyglass and confirmed his worst fears. The Cassidy gang had somehow learned of their presence and was systematically searching the area. Morrison realized they had been betrayed. Someone in Silver Creek must have seen them heading into the mountains and reported back to Cassidy's men. The gang leader was known for his paranoia and his habit of eliminating potential witnesses to his crimes. Sarah and her children represented loose ends that he wouldn't allow to remain untied. The cabin's location provided some protection, hidden as it was among the pine trees and rocky outcroppings. But Morrison knew it was only a matter of time before the searchers worked their way up the mountain. He began preparing for what seemed inevitable, a final confrontation with men who showed no mercy to women and children. His arsenal was limited but effective. The Colt .45 at his hip, a Winchester rifle and a sawed-off shotgun he kept hidden in his saddlebags. He had enough ammunition for a prolonged fight, but against 6 or 7 men, the odds were decidedly against him. Still, he had faced worse situations and survived through a combination of skill, cunning, and sheer determination. Sarah proved to be more resourceful than he had expected. She had grown up on the frontier and knew how to handle a rifle, having helped her father defend their property from Indian raids years earlier. Morrison gave her Thomas's old hunting rifle and showed her the best positions around the cabin for covering the approaches. The children were frightened but brave. Tommy helped gather rocks that could be used as weapons if necessary, while Mary stayed close to her mother, clutching the wooden cross she had saved from their destroyed home. Morrison found himself wondering if his own daughter would have shown such courage in similar circumstances. As night fell, Morrison made his rounds, checking the approaches to the cabin and setting up early warning systems using tin cans and string. The mountain air was crisp and clear, carrying sounds for miles. He could hear the distant murmur of voices as the searchers made camp in the valley below, no doubt planning their assault for the following day. Sleep came fitfully that night. Morrison took the first watch, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Sarah relieved him around midnight, proving she could move silently through the forest despite her long skirts and the burden of worry for her children's safety. Dawn brought with it the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Morrison counted at least 5 riders making their way up the mountain trail, moving with the confidence of men who believed they had cornered their prey. He recognized Red Cassidy's voice, calling out demands for surrender, promising that no harm would come to the woman and children. Morrison knew better than to trust such promises. He had seen too many of Cassidy's victims to believe the outlaw capable of mercy. The bounty hunter positioned himself at the cabin's front window, while Sarah took up her post at the back, ready to protect her children with her life, if necessary. The first shots came without warning. Cassidy's men had spread out around the cabin, firing from concealed positions among the rocks and trees. Morrison returned fire with careful precision, making each shot count. His first bullet found its mark, dropping one of the attackers with a cry of pain and surprise. The battle that followed was fierce but brief. Morrison's superior position and accurate shooting took its toll on the attackers, while Sarah's covering fire prevented them from flanking the cabin. When the shooting finally stopped, 3 of Cassidy's men lay dead or wounded in the rocky clearing. But Morrison knew this was only the beginning. Red Cassidy was not the type of man to accept defeat easily, and he had resources throughout the territory that he could call upon. The bounty hunter realized that their only hope lay in turning the tables, becoming the hunters instead of the hunted. That night, under cover of darkness, Morrison made his move. He left Sarah and the children in the cabin with strict instructions to barricade themselves inside and wait for his return. Moving like a ghost through the mountain forest, he tracked the remaining gang members to their camp in the valley below. What he found there changed everything. Cassidy was not just seeking revenge for his fallen men, he was planning something much larger. Morrison overheard conversations about a planned raid on the Silver Creek bank, timed to coincide with the monthly shipment of silver from the nearby mines. The amount of money involved would be staggering. Morrison also learned something else that chilled his blood. Cassidy had put word out throughout the territory that he would pay a substantial reward for information leading to the capture of the woman and children. He wanted them alive, for reasons that Morrison could only imagine were connected to his twisted sense of justice. The bounty hunter made his decision quickly. He couldn't protect Sarah and her children indefinitely while remaining on the defensive. His only option was to end the threat permanently, and that meant taking the fight directly to Red Cassidy and his remaining men. Using skills honed through years of tracking dangerous criminals, Morrison began systematically eliminating Cassidy's men one by one. He used the mountain terrain to his advantage, striking from concealment and disappearing before his targets could react. By dawn, only Cassidy himself remained alive, his paranoia growing with each hour. The final confrontation came at sunrise in the clearing where Thomas Coleman had been murdered. Morrison stepped out of the tree line with his hands at his sides, his Colt, a .45 ready for the fastest draw of his life. Cassidy emerged from the burned ruins of the farmhouse, his scarred face twisted with rage and the promise of violence. The 2 men faced each other across 20 yards of ash-covered ground. Morrison could see the madness in Cassidy's eyes, the desperate fury of a cornered animal. When the outlaw's hand moved toward his gun, Morrison was ready. His draw was smooth and practiced, the result of countless hours of training and years of survival. Cassidy's bullet went wide, his aim spoiled by anger and desperation. Morrison's shot was true, striking the outlaw in the chest and sending him sprawling backward into the ashes of the home he had destroyed. Red Cassidy died as he had lived, surrounded by the devastation he had brought to innocent lives. Morrison returned to the cabin to find Sarah and her children safe but shaken. The ordeal had aged them all, but they had survived when many others had not. The bounty hunter collected the rewards on Cassidy and his men, money that would provide Sarah with the means to start over somewhere far from the memories of tragedy. They traveled together to Denver, where Sarah used her share of the reward money to purchase a small boarding house near the growing city center. It was a respectable business that would provide steady income while allowing her to raise her children in relative safety and comfort. Morrison stayed long enough to ensure they were settled and secure. On his last evening in Denver, as he sat on the boarding house porch watching Tommy and Mary play in the yard, Sarah joined him. She spoke quietly about the future she was building for her children and the gratitude she felt for the man who had risked everything to protect them. The bounty hunter left Denver the next morning, riding south toward rumors of new outlaws and fresh bounties. But something had changed in him during those weeks in the mountains. The solitary existence that had defined his life for so long no longer seemed quite as appealing as it once had. 6 months later, Morrison returned to Denver. He had captured 3 more wanted men and collected substantial rewards, but his thoughts had often turned to the boarding house and the small family he had helped protect. He found Sarah's business thriving, her children healthy and happy in their new life. This time, Morrison stayed. He hung up his guns and used his savings to purchase a partnership in Sarah's boarding house. Tommy and Mary came to see him as the father figure they had lost, while Sarah and Morrison discovered that the bond forged in crisis had grown into something deeper and more lasting. Years later, when Tommy asked about his stepfather's past as a bounty hunter, Morrison would tell him stories of the Old West and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. He never spoke of the violence and death that had marked those years, preferring to focus on the lessons of courage and justice. The boarding house became a haven for travelers and settlers heading west, a place where weary souls could find rest and safety. Morrison's reputation as a former bounty hunter helped maintain order without the need for violence, while Sarah's gentle nature made everyone feel welcome. On quiet evenings, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, Sarah and Morrison would sometimes speak of that terrible day when their paths had first crossed. They never forgot the price of their happiness or the debt they owed to fate for bringing them together in the darkest of circumstances. The Old West was changing, with railroads bringing civilization to the frontier and law enforcement becoming more organized and effective. Men like Red Cassidy were becoming relics of a more violent past, replaced by a new generation that valued prosperity over plunder. Morrison adapted to these changes, using his knowledge of criminal behavior to help local law enforcement when needed. But his days of solitary pursuit were over, replaced by a life centered around family and community. He had found something worth more than any bounty: the peace that comes from protecting those you love. Morrison's new life brought unexpected challenges that tested his resolve in ways his bounty hunting days never had. Running a boarding house required patience and diplomacy, skills he had never needed when tracking outlaws across the wilderness. But Sarah's guidance helped him navigate the complexities of civilian life with grace. The first real test came when a group of drunken cowboys tried to intimidate other guests in the boarding house dining room. Morrison's instinct was to reach for the gun he no longer wore, but instead he used his imposing presence and calm authority to defuse the situation without violence. Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway with pride. As Tommy grew older, he began asking more pointed questions about his stepfather's past. The boy had inherited his father's curiosity and his mother's sharp intelligence. Morrison found himself sharing carefully chosen stories that emphasized justice over violence, teaching the boy that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. Mary, now 10 years old, had developed into a bright and spirited child who reminded Morrison daily of his own lost daughter. She would often sit beside him on the porch in the evenings, reading aloud from books while he whittled small toys for the children of visiting families. These quiet moments brought him a peace he had never known existed. The boarding house attracted all manner of travelers, from prosperous merchants to struggling families seeking new opportunities in the growing territories. Morrison developed an uncanny ability to read people, a skill that proved invaluable in maintaining the safety and reputation of their establishment. One autumn evening, a well-dressed stranger arrived claiming to be a traveling salesman. But Morrison's trained eye caught the subtle signs that marked the man as something far more dangerous. The way he positioned himself near exits, the careful manner in which he observed other guests, and the telltale bulge beneath his coat all suggested a man accustomed to violence. Morrison watched the stranger carefully over the next few days, noting how he asked seemingly innocent questions about the local bank and the schedules of prominent citizens. When the man inquired about the best routes out of town, Morrison knew his suspicions were justified. This was reconnaissance for a planned robbery. Rather than confront the stranger directly, Morrison used his network of contacts within the local law enforcement to quietly investigate the man's background. What they discovered confirmed his worst fears. The stranger was part of a new gang that had been terrorizing settlements throughout Colorado Territory. Morrison faced a dilemma that cut to the heart of his new identity. He could alert the authorities and let them handle the situation, but that might result in a violent confrontation that could endanger Sarah and the children. Alternatively, he could handle the matter himself, but doing so would mean reverting to the methods of his old life. The decision was made for him when he overheard the stranger talking quietly with two Confederates who had arrived that morning. They were planning to rob the Denver First National Bank during the busy Friday afternoon when miners came to town to deposit their weekly earnings. The timing would maximize both the available cash and the potential for innocent casualties. Morrison made his choice with the same decisive clarity that had kept him alive during his bounty hunting years. He would stop these men, but he would do it in a way that protected his family and maintained the peaceful life they had built together. The old Morrison would have simply gunned them down, but the new Morrison had learned the value of subtlety. Working with the local sheriff, Morrison devised a plan to capture the gang without bloodshed. They would allow the criminals to believe their plan was proceeding smoothly while actually walking into a carefully prepared trap. The sheriff's men would be positioned strategically around the bank, while Morrison himself would be inside, posing as a customer. The plan worked flawlessly. When the three outlaws entered the bank with guns drawn, they found themselves surrounded by armed lawmen with no avenue of escape. The leader, the well-dressed stranger from the boarding house, looked directly at Morrison with a mixture of surprise and grudging respect before surrendering his weapon. As the prisoners were led away, the bank president thanked Morrison publicly for his role in preventing what could have been a tragic robbery. The bounty hunter turned boarding house proprietor simply tipped his hat and returned to his family, satisfied that justice had been served without unnecessary violence. Word of Morrison's involvement in capturing the gang spread throughout Denver, enhancing the reputation of their boarding house as a safe and respectable establishment. Business improved dramatically, allowing them to expand their operation and hire additional staff to help manage the increased demand. Sarah proved to be a shrewd businesswoman in her own right, implementing innovations that set their establishment apart from competitors. She instituted a policy of serving home-cooked meals, family style, creating an atmosphere that made travelers feel welcome rather than merely tolerated. Her natural warmth and Morrison's quiet strength made a formidable combination. Tommy, now approaching his 16th birthday, had grown into a young man who combined his mother's intelligence with his stepfather's determination. He expressed interest in studying law, Inspired by Morrison's stories of justice and his own desire to help people resolve conflicts peacefully rather than through violence. Morrison supported the boys' ambitions wholeheartedly, recognizing that education represented the future of the changing West. He arranged for Tommy to work part-time at a local law office, where the young man could learn the practical aspects of legal work while continuing his formal education. Mary had developed into a talented artist, spending hours sketching the various characters who passed through their boarding house. Her drawings captured not just the physical appearance of their guests, but something deeper about their personalities and motivations. Morrison often marveled at her ability to see into people's hearts. As the seasons turned and Denver continued to grow around them, Morrison reflected on the unexpected path his life had taken. The solitary existence he had once embraced now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the rich complexity of family life and community involvement. The boarding house had become more than just a business. It was a hub of activity that brought together people from all walks of life. Morrison found himself serving as an informal counselor and mediator, helping resolve disputes and offering advice to travelers facing difficult decisions about their futures. One particularly memorable guest was an elderly prospector named Ezra, who had spent 40 years searching for the motherlode that always seemed just beyond his reach. Morrison listened to the man's stories of hardship and perseverance, recognizing a kindred spirit who had spent his life pursuing an elusive goal. When Ezra finally struck gold in a played-out claim everyone else had abandoned, he returned to the boarding house to share his good fortune. But more importantly, he credited Morrison with helping him understand that the real treasure wasn't the gold itself, but the relationships and experiences he had gained along the way. These interactions reminded Morrison daily that his decision to abandon the bounty hunter's life had been the right one. Instead of tracking men to their deaths, he was now helping people find their way to better lives. The transformation had been complete and irreversible. Sarah often told him that he had saved her family twice, once from Red Cassidy's gang, and again from the despair and hopelessness that could have consumed them after Thomas's death. But Morrison knew the truth was more complex. They had saved each other, creating something new and beautiful from the ashes of their respective tragedies. As winter settled over Denver and the boarding house filled with travelers seeking shelter from the mountain snows, Morrison stood on the front porch, watching his family prepare for the evening meal. Sarah moved gracefully through the dining room, ensuring each guest felt welcome, while Tommy helped serve and Mary entertained the children with her drawings. The contentment Morrison felt in that moment was deeper and more satisfying than any he had experienced during his years as a bounty hunter. He had finally found what he had been searching for all along, though he hadn't realized it at the time. He had found home and family and purpose beyond the pursuit of justice through violence. The old Morrison would have scoffed at such sentimentality, but the new Morrison understood that true strength lay not in the ability to take life, but in the courage to nurture and protect it. He had learned that the greatest bounty of all was the love of a good woman and the trust of children who looked to him for guidance and protection. What do you think about Morrison's transformation from a solitary bounty hunter to a family man? Share in the comments below whether you believe people can truly change their nature or if circumstances simply reveal who we really are deep inside.